Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning. My name is Jacob Kurtzer. I'm the Interim Director of the Humanitarian Agenda at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. On behalf of CSIS and the Middle East program, thank you all for joining us today. Prior to the onset of COVID-19, Lebanon faced a daunting set of crises, including a collapsing currency and an economic and enduring political turmoil. An estimated 50% of the population is now in poverty, and in 2020 alone, the level of extreme poverty has increased to nearly 25% of the population. Lebanon has long been a destination for refugees. Palestinian refugees in Lebanon currently number nearly 500,000, and tens of thousands of Iraqi refugees entered Lebanon during the peak of the war in Iraq. And beginning in 2011, the Syrian civil war has displaced over 1 million refugees, including additional Palestinians. Conflict between Hezbollah and Israel has historically triggered internal displacement and humanitarian need. The large-scale conflict with Israel in 2006 displaced nearly 1 million people, triggering further economic volatility. And in 2020, clashes between Hezbollah and Israeli forces on the southern border have stoked further tension. Through it all, marginalized groups such as expatriate domestic workers and the substantial refugee population face heightened risks as Lebanon's large-scale crises collide. Migrant workers are experiencing rising unemployment and homelessness due to Lebanon's deteriorating economic climate. And while challenges for marginalized groups is not new, the increase in humanitarian need following the Beirut port explosion has brought the feeling to the forefront. Many refugees and expatriate domestic workers report being denied domestic humanitarian aid due to their status. So today's discussion gives us a chance to talk about how to respond and support all people in Lebanon during this difficult moment. And so I thank our panelists for joining us today, for sharing your time and for your ongoing work. I'd like to now hand it over to our moderator, Dr. Jon Alterman. Dr. Alterman is the Senior Vice President, holds the Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy, and is Director of the Middle East Program at CSIS. Over to you, Dr. Alterman.
Thank you very much, Jake, and thank you very much for joining us today. As Jake said, Lebanon has often been a site of turmoil, but we haven't really thought either about the acute turmoil that Lebanon is facing now or the effect of that turmoil on marginalized groups. We are tremendously fortunate to have three excellent speakers today to help us understand the role of marginalized groups in Lebanon and the effect of Lebanon's cascading crises on them. I'd like to introduce them in turn. The first is Sahar Atrache, Senior Advocate for the Middle East at Refugees International. She was Senior Advocacy Officer for the Syrian American Medical Society and was a Senior Analyst for the Middle East and North Africa at the International Crisis Group. We also have Yasmin Kayali, co-founder and CCO of Basman Zaytuna, a nonprofit organization launched in 2012 that seeks to empower Syrians in exile to live lives of dignity. Basman Zaytuna designs and delivers effective relief, education, livelihood, and protection services to marginalized communities in 6 centers across Lebanon. And then we also have Banchi Yimer, a former domestic worker who lived in Lebanon for nearly a decade. Alongside fellow Ethiopian migrant workers, she founded Enya Lenya, Us for Ourselves, a community-based organization working on migrant domestic workers issues and women's issues in Lebanon and Ethiopia. So to all of our panelists, thank you very much for joining us. We have a lot to cover. First, I thought we might start with Sahar. How does the Lebanese system work in general, and how do these marginalized groups, people from outside of Lebanon, either by birth or an origin, how do they fit into the Lebanese system?
Hi, thank you, John. Yeah, it's a good question. I think so. the government structure itself, how the Lebanese system works itself, I think leave a lot of the communities inside Lebanon vulnerable and marginalized. I just want to first, explain very quickly what was going on in Lebanon in the past 20 years. So I'm not going to go into details. I just want to talk about the heavy polarization that we've witnessed, the paralysis over and over that, struck the system in Lebanon. But overall, the Lebanese system is based on patronage. It's a sectarian system where political leaders and political parties who've been governing these countries for decades and have very interest, don't really have an interest in promoting, a rule of law and state institutions that would work and govern the country, on a meritocracy basis. So basically, there's an interest within this political class, all parties alike, is basically to leave a wide range of the society dependent on the political leader, dependent on the system to access even the most basic needs, healthcare, for example, is not accessible for many Lebanese, and most of the time you have to go through a leader, what we call in Lebanon, the wasta, to be able to access healthcare, even sometimes water and other services. The state's institutions are not doesn't work, on a competency basis, as I mentioned, and this is a part of the system as a whole. The Lebanese political class in general has, because this is the sectarian and patronage-based system, has no interest really in dealing with non-Lebanese communities. So what we've seen, for example, when it comes to Syrian refugees, Palestinian refugees, but also migrant workers, is they are mostly left to others. Most of the time, it's the so-called international community, UN agencies or civil society organization to deal with, because there's no interest really in having a kind of a society where these different leaders take responsibility and assume their role. It's mostly, again, working for their very own interest. So what we've seen, for example, with the Palestinian, regardless of the history between Lebanon and the Palestinian, presence, is that it's mostly dealt with by UNRWA, and the Lebanese government doesn't even enter the camps. We've seen the same kind of phenomenon, of course, with various degrees and with a very different history, but also with the Syrian refugees. Except for a few times where the Lebanese Ministry of Education or Ministry of Health was able to deal with the presence of Syrian refugees. Overall, this presence was mostly left to UNHCR and to international humanitarian workers. Hello?
Yeah, so the point I understand you making is that it's a system that relies on patronage to get things. And if you don't have citizenship, you have to rely on forces outside the country rather than forces inside the country, because the forces inside the country are all aligned to different patronage networks, which are tied to political and economic power. Is that, so they capture it?
Yes, very true, yeah.
And so,
yes.
And so and Yasmin founded an organization that was intended to address this problem. So Yasmin, could you tell us about Besmen Zaytoun and what you're trying to do and how you overcome the system that Sahar just described?
So just as Sahar described, usually the humanitarian sector or the philanthropic sector within Lebanon always has a belonging or a pegging either to a sect or a political party, etc. I, as a Syrian national married to Lebanese back in 2011, co-founded Basma Zaytoune along with my peers. We were all just volunteering at the beginning with relief work, hoping to fill the gap that the INGOs were leaving behind, because there was a huge exodus of Syrian refugees into the country. They didn't know what to do with them. And also, just to set the context, as Syrians, we were not used to reaching out to organizations. We didn't know how to manage this. We didn't know how to manage the registration with the UNHCR, etc. And so you had people who were really falling through the cracks. And we were trying to go there, trying to go to the most marginalized. The fact that the status of the Syrian refugees within Lebanon was very unique, in that they were not recognized as refugees. They are immigrants in Lebanon, which does not allow them any rights. And they are hosted within already highly marginalized communities. So one of the biggest settlements would be in Shatila camp, which is originally a Palestinian camp, 1 kilometer squared, detrimental infrastructure. And that is where we set up our first center. Working in Lebanon is a challenge, to say the least. Politics, stigma, banking, retention of employees, being able to legally register an organization as Syrians. The only reason I was able to register the organization is because I got the Lebanese nationality from my husband, or else we would not have been able to actually register the organization and apply for grants abroad. And the recent crackdown also on Lebanese CSOs, even before the revolution started, has made things even more and more difficult. And you see that most of the Lebanese and the Syrian minds that are capable to work in this sphere are all leaving the country because they need to search for opportunities elsewhere. We started our work, yes, to respond to the needs of Syrian refugees. Slowly, we started to also service Palestinian refugees. And then as the situation in the country grew more and more difficult, we started to service the whole community. We believe in the community center. We believe in entrenching ourselves within the community and being responsive to the community and its needs. And of course, now with the COVID.
Community, who does that encompass? I mean,
Pardon?
by community, so that's a combination of Syrians who are
Syrians, Palestinians, Iraqis, Kurds, migrant workers of all, Sudanese, Ethiopians, Lebanese living in the south, Lebanese living in Tripoli, Lebanese living in Nab'a, highly marginalized areas with no infrastructure, with no support. Even when it comes to education, a lot of these areas, the schools cannot support even the local community, let alone the refugee community. And this is going to be much worse this year, especially with the explosion and with the COVID. The public sector in education cannot even support the Lebanese kids. How about all of these other migrant kids that the Ministry of Education tried to absorb? We have 500,000 Syrian kids alone, okay? 250,000 were absorbed by the public education system. But now you have all of these Lebanese children leaving the private schools, the private Lebanese schools, and going to public schools. So there's no place for Syrian kids. So on top of the 250,000 already on the streets with no chance of education, that is if they live within proximity to a school in the first place. Because, for example, in the Beqa, if you don't secure transportation for kids, they cannot go to school. They cannot make the transportation. Within Shatila, the Basma Zaytoune school is the only school for Syrians, and there's one school for UNRWA. That's the only school. And all of the migrant workers that were living within the camp did not have any access to any education.
Right. I want to bring Banchi into this conversation because you've been a member of a group that is one of the marginalized groups that Yasmin and Sahar were talking about. No citizenship, often limited access to legal protections. What was the environment you saw, and how has that environment changed since Lebanon's economy weakened and COVID and everything else? Banchi, I think you're muted.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. So most people think the problem for the domestic worker just started because of the financial crisis or the explosion or the COVID. But the situation, the abuse against domestic worker didn't start yet. It has been in Lebanon over decades. What we're facing because of the kafala system, we're not included in labor law. Like she mentioned, we don't have right even to organize ourselves, and we have no right of movement or leaving the country without the sponsor permission. Kafala by itself, once when you enter in Lebanon under your sponsor name, you have no right to quit, you have no right to travel, and it's except to your sponsor, except to your agency. They allow you or not if you like your job, if you're sick, if you have been abused, we have no right to quit and travel home. And also on the other side, no one there to protect us. There's no accountability. And domestic worker by herself, she cannot go out, put a complaint against her sponsor, and we depend on NGOs or what can I say? It's a lot to take in, and the environment I was there like from the day I arrived in Lebanon until now, believe it has been 9 years since I saw my own passport. I left Lebanon without my passport. So since you arrive in Lebanon, they'll take your passport. You will never see your passport. We have no right in our own ID or passport. And that's even before the financial crisis. And we, true to our work, we met a woman who unpaid for over 6 years, 10 years, and 12 years. And women who's been enslaved, women who's been raped, women who's been like suicide or 2 domestic workers died per week and no investigation. And everything, every report comes the same. Either she flees when she clean, or she lost her mind, or she's crazy and then she hang herself, or she throw herself. That's the thing even before the financial crisis started. So
and to give us a picture, how many domestic workers are there in Lebanon, and where are they from?
Okay, according to the Ethiopian ambassador, we are 400,000 domestic workers in Lebanon. That's the statistics gives Ethiopian ambassador. And according to the Lebanese government, all domestic workers, including Ethiopian, they are over 250,000 in Lebanon. But still, there's an exact number how many we are. Everybody's giving their own guess. And
right.
We have like over 12 nationality domestic workers in Lebanon, included like the majority are African. We are Ethiopian are 77% of domestic worker in Lebanon. Okay. So all nationality are facing the same, makes the Ethiopian worse because our government not responsive, and embassy, and also we are the majority.
Right.
But all of us, we face like the same treatment in Lebanon.
So I want to go back to Sahar, and you, I mean, we've heard about different groups. We've heard about domestic workers, we've heard about Syrians and Palestinians and Iraqis. As you described the Lebanese system, a lot depends on patronage. Do these groups experience things differently depending on where they're from? Is it different for Arabs versus non-Arabs? Is it different for Palestinians versus Iraqis versus Syrians? I mean, how does it manifest when you're talking about individuals and breaking down the groups?
Sure. Yeah, I definitely think there's differences that these different community experience. I bet for like Banchi, she's working about Ethiopian workers. There's a racist dimension to it that we also see within the Lebanese community. There is, unfortunately, this sense, that African workers are, considered, less, let's say things by their names. I think, so there's definitely the difference, I think, between, Arabs and non-Arabs, mostly if they're Africans, there's also like increased racism against them. But I definitely think Yasmin can speak a lot to the racism also that is experienced by Syrians, by Palestinians. So for Palestinians, for example, there's the history of the war between Lebanon and Syria. And a lot of Lebanese, blame Palestinians for what happened and don't, like take responsibility for our own, role in the war and what have been also inflicted to Palestinian. So I can give you an example. For example, during the August 4 explosion, like there has, the sense of community that Yasmin talked about, and some Syrian and some Palestinian and even Ethiopian, groups tried to come and support people who've been affected by the explosion. And we've heard reports about, some resident refusing to accept this help, just because we're talking about, a Palestinian organization or another Syrian or so unfortunately there's the definitely the I would say like the social dimension. There's no education to the Lebanese, society about the rights. For me, how I see the main problem is a rule of law problem. Because, in Lebanon, and because it's a system that's based mostly on networking and, relationships and patronage with political officials and leaders, and sometimes even tribal connections or family connections, there's a lot of, if in lots of areas, we feel there's a lack of sense of the right of others, and many communities are just denied rights, as Banchi mentioned, like the simple right of freedom of movements for like domestic workers, specifically those who work in houses, is denied, like their ID is basically confiscated. But the problem is that the state institutions basically implement these measures. There is when domestic workers arrive in Beirut airport, and I've seen it with my own eyes, like the officer would hand the passport to the, employer, assuming, that this is a very normal thing to do. So it's, again, we go back to the whole system that's really doesn't have the protection of individuals, of citizens, of whether they have the nationality or not in their mind.
That's interesting. I wanted to ask Yasmin, because you both deal with a variety of these groups, and then you said you also have a lot of Lebanese who you work with. First, how do the different groups who don't have citizenship in Lebanon relate to each other in your experience? And also, are you seeing changes in the ways marginalized Lebanese are dealing with marginalized Syrians, marginalized Palestinians, marginalized domestic workers, and others?
So on the first point, speaking, well, Sahar was speaking, actually, it's not only the domestic workers that don't have the right for freedom of movement. I'm sure you're aware that there are curfews that are imposed in certain areas in Beirut where Syrians are not allowed to leave their homes after certain hours. Also, even if you apply for the renewal of your residency or Iqama and you pay for it and you have all the legal papers, for months and months, you wait for a response from the Secretary General and you don't get it. And even now, passing through Lebanon for the last 2 years has been like even impossible. Even if you have like a visa to go to another country, you need to secure cash and the hotel booking, confirmed hotel booking, etc. It's becoming like jumping through hoops, even just to pass through Lebanon, not even to reside in Lebanon, let alone have legal work papers. And that is why you will find that the Syrians are attracted to certain areas to live, where they feel that it's easier for them to move around. For example, Shatila. People assume that people go to Shatila because it's cheap. Shatila is not cheap at all. The smallest shack, because these are not houses, they are shacks that they live in, goes for $200 a month, and you can pay a rent for up to $1,000 a month in a place that is a slum. Okay, but it's because it's not a hostile environment where they feel they are welcome. There is a unity of challenges, if I may say. The Palestinians, I have to admit, have been very welcoming. We have many challenges. You know, one of the biggest challenges that we have as Syrians is burial. When somebody passes away, it is so difficult and so challenging to finalize their papers and to find them a burial spot. Especially when you're fundraising, for example, to secure medical support for someone, education, whatever. But asking somebody to pay for a burial site or to finalize papers for someone, it's very, very difficult. The Palestinians have been very welcoming when it comes to this and have helped us a lot. And we do have running programs that are programs that try to integrate, for example, there was a lot of friction in the Bekaa region specifically because also the narrative by the government has always been, you don't have jobs because the Syrians came. We don't have electricity because the Syrians came. We have economic problems because the Syrians came. Actually, the Syrians injected loads of money into the banking sector. Okay, if we're talking about the upper class of Syrians who left Syria and moved their money, and the only place where they could open accounts was in Lebanon. Second, all the aid that was coming in for the Syrians and wasn't reaching the Syrians, be it for education, be it for any other kind of support, this was all supporting the system, which finally crumbled because of the deep pockets, and the amount of corruption. But it's very unfortunate that what Sahar was saying is very true, that even when we went down from the first day of the explosion and we set up our tent in Karantina, okay, as Basman Zaytoune, some Lebanese channels were conducting interviews with the volunteers and the activists on the ground. And when they were doing an interview with us and we identified ourselves as Syrians, Palestinians, and Lebanese trying to help, the journalists would walk away. They don't want to acknowledge even that we are working on the ground, even though we were clearing out debris, we were distributing food to people, we were distributing aid. Not even ever we have never differentiated on people's sect, where they belong, their political affiliation. It doesn't matter. When you're in need, you're in need. But and even many other organizations who were conducting needs assessments, as soon as they knew that it was Syrians or foreign workers who were residing in that home, they would walk away and they would not include them in their assessment. We know for a fact a Sri Lankan lady, 20 years living in Lebanon, and she's the doorwoman of the building, and she helped everybody clean out their house. But when it came to the distribution of aid and to fixing up the little room that she lived in, no NGO was willing to help her. And there are numerous cases like this. And it's a shame, because if that lady had lived in any other country after 20 years and birthing her children there, she would have the citizenship. She has more right to the citizenship. She has served this country and its people for 20 years. And this is what we tell them, even us, like, we're always on the defensive. Like, why are you, as a refugee-led organization, now involved in the rebuilding of Beirut? Forget me, okay? Forget me, as I'm married to a Lebanese, my children are Lebanese. All of our volunteers and even our beneficiaries tell you, Beirut has hosted us for the last 10 years. It is our home. So many Syrians were impacted by the explosion. So many Syrians passed away. Karantina, all the workers from the port, all the daily workers who live there, they have nothing. They are still now sleeping outdoors on tattered mattresses, and nobody has reached out to help them. We are trying our best to fundraise and get the funding and the support to help rebuild their homes and other homes of Lebanese equally, but we're always on the defensive. We have to defend what we want to do and why we want to take this initiative.
I want to go to Banchi and ask more about solidarity between marginalized groups. And then I do want to get to this issue of the international angle. Banchi, you said that the domestic workers are a varied group. Yasmin described partnerships between Syrians and Palestinians and accommodations. How does it work among domestic workers? Are there ties across nationalities? Does language prevent that? How is that community of people, however many 100,000 there are?
When we started in Nyalenya, we just started for Ethiopian domestic worker because we're the majority and we have difficulty of communication language and we are very strict and culture and certain things. So since the financial crisis, we are helping all nationality domestic workers in Lebanon, included even Sudanese. Yasmin mentioned most of it, so I'm trying to my best not to repeat what they mentioned. So the domestic worker the racism is there from the beginning, even in post crisis, and the time when we need assistance, we left alone to starve. And one embassy I know of is Philippine embassy distributed. Other than that, all embassy, all government back home, and most organizations held on other nationality left the domestic worker to starve alone. So no medical assistance, no food assistance. The landlord also were kicking domestic worker, even by Lebanese government law. No one has the right to kick out the domestic worker. What they do is just left us on the street. Even yesterday, 6 Sierra Leone women were kicked out from their apartment, and we heard, and we have to pay and then talk to the landlord to get them back. So even for in those moments, this is the time where you shouldn't see this Lebanese or Ethiopian or Sierra Leone. It doesn't matter. We all are human beings and we're facing a hard time. So we should be able to support each other. I saw Ethiopian, other nationalities here, and everyone was cleaning the street and fixing the house. But what we get in return is starved and alone and without any support. And when I come to communicate, what we do is, and as our organization, we collaborate with different nationality community leaders. So be true to them. So we have a system so they can go and reach out and see what the community needs. So based on that, we assist and whatever needed. And a daily basis, we receive between 30 to 100 calls per day for food assistance. So we mix all nationality. Whoever calls gets the foods. We don't say this is Ethiopian, this is Sri Lankan. All it's equal what we do in terms of medication or food assistance, rent, or any house supplies. So I want to mention after the explosion and after the financial crisis, the women would get paid for 10, 12 years, and the sponsors stopped paying any salary. And the women inside, thousands of domestic workers are inside the house without salary. The sponsor refused to send them home or to refuse to pay them. And most of them are undocumented, no insurance, they have no medical access, and still they are like some of them running on the street exposed for rape and COVID. And some of them even thrown on the street by their sponsor. You see all over the media sleeping like Kenyan, Ethiopian, Gambian, Nigerian. So we have to go every embassy to distribute food, masks, and sanitizers, because those women, like I check their medical record like every single day, and we get the woman who's been exposed by COVID. The majority are the one who kicked out by the sponsor on the street or run from abuse. So we don't even have free PCR tests. We don't even have free access for medication in this bad time. So but still we communicating, we're doing our best. The racism is there. We don't have anyone to help us. We have to help each other, even we're not allowed to help each other.
Right. So first, I want to do several things. First, I want to remind our audience that if you'd like to ask a question to our panelists, there's a button on the event page on the CSS website, and you can submit a question. I have several questions. I'd be happy to take some more. I want to ask each of you about what the international community can do, both international organizations, governments, what from your perspective is missing. And then also, before we go to audience questions, I want very quickly what you think people in the audience can and should do. So first, let's talk about the broad, what do large organizations outside of Lebanon, what can they do, what should they be doing that they're not doing? I say whether it's the UN, whether it's the US government, whether it's the EU, what do you think the big players in this need to be doing that they're not doing? And I'll look for a signal from any of you who wants to start off. Okay, Yasmin.
I think beyond just the UN and the EU, even if we're talking about the larger donors or the larger INGOs, I think it's been some time now, not only for refugee-led organizations, but the general civil society in Lebanon has grown and matured to a level where we can now stand up for ourselves and we can voice our opinions, but they need to give us that channel, like you're doing today. So we need to get connected through their powerful connections and networks. We need the opportunities to have our voices heard. So it's not just about relief funds and distribution and food baskets. It's about real and tangible advocacy for all these causes that we're talking about. Applying the pressure and leaving no one behind. So everybody being included in this. And last but not least, like for us as an organization, they really need to look at empowering the organizations, allowing the organizations to design whatever programs and responses they deem best for the communities that they service, and to have long-term partnerships. So we don't want those 6 months interventions and then they turn away. We need multi-year, because multi-year, long-term interventions that will really have an impact on these communities. Change is not going to happen, not in 4 months and not in 6 months. It takes years. You're changing mentalities, you're changing livelihoods, and you're trying to better people's quality of life. This is not going to happen in a couple of months. And this is the kind of commitment that we need.
Thank you. Banchi or Sahar, what are you?
From big NGOs, like she mentioned, we're struggling also with the funds. We do the majority job in Lebanon for domestic workers, but we're not getting any funds. We get few organization involvement, and we are pretty much the GoFundMe to assist thousands of domestic workers. They don't have to say this is domestic worker organization, because we are the one doing the job. We should have these supports. This is my message. They need to support us more, so where we can do more. And in terms of government level, and we have two problems. One is domestic worker, they've been working without salary for years. This financial crisis started 2019. Even before that, some of them didn't get paid, and after that also no one's getting paid. The one also who's been abused, run on the street, and undocumented also, they have no money. They depend on us for food and any medication assistance. They want to go home. They don't want to stay in Lebanon. They want to go home. They're stuck for two reasons. One is they don't have any money for repatriation and we needed the support. Two is the system is still in this bad time. The system is there. The woman has to wait outside on the street sleeping until the paper is done. So the exit visa is very complicated. We want them to push the Lebanese government, and the exit visa process has to be removed. The domestic worker should allow to go home. So we want the international people or governments, United States government or anyone, to push the Lebanese government. They have to remove the system. The women need to go home.
Okay, thank you. And Sahar?
Yeah, so I definitely agree with Yasmin and Banchi. There's already a strong civil society in Lebanon that really needs to be empowered and that needs to be given, the opportunity to plan for what's going on in the country. I think that the approach where UN agencies or internationals who comes, for like limited time has proved sometimes to be a bit problematic. But there's definitely the broader picture where, we're not just talking about the humanitarian aid, like the direct supporting, food assistance or shelters. We're talking about a country who's really is on the verge of a humanitarian crisis. It's on the verge of collapse. And I think there's a wider international role to be played here. By donor countries, by the UN, by international organizations, to support really the Lebanese society, because, basically what led the country to where we are right now, to the verge of collapse, is a political class that's been doing the business as usual, entrenching its own interest, ignoring really the interest of communities and citizens inside the country. I'm not saying this is definitely going to be very challenging, because the question is, how can you support the Lebanese society? How can you support Lebanon really in a, to help it, bring it back from, this economic downturn, from the impact of the August 4 explosion, while the institutions are, festering in corruption and mismanagement and lack of competences. I don't claim to have, an answer for that, but there is definitely some work to be done, and maybe starting small with what Yasmin mentioned is really supporting the so-called local, actors. Yeah.
Okay, so I think maybe we'll close with the issue of what the audience can do. We got a question from Madeline Murphy in Glasgow. What can stakeholders do to bring host communities and refugees together? What can, I guess this is probably external stakeholders. What can they do to bring these communities of Lebanese and non-Lebanese together?
Actually, we have many programs, social cohesion programs that we run, and they are based on psychosocial support and with the help of social workers and drama and art and theater. And in order first to break down the walls that are between the host communities and the marginalized communities, in the sense that, we all have the same problem. We're all suffering from the same thing. But I think that now our major issue is that resources are so scarce and people are so hungry and scared. And so you tend to stick with your own. So now is a very difficult time to administer these kinds of programs. But before, we're really advocating for them because it's so important. And it's so important to raise awareness, because in the end, there are many things that are ingrained. Because like Sahar was saying, there's all the history with the Palestinians, with the Syrians, with the domestic workers, all those stereotypes that the Lebanese society has ingrained into it. And you need to work on this and chip at it. And it takes programming, and it takes long-term programming to do something like that.
We have another question from Adia Hindawi from the Business and Human Rights Resources Center. And I think it's probably for Sahar. To what extent are international financial institutions responsible for either creating or abetting this system of patronage that discriminates between beneficiaries, that seems to exclude some people from economic opportunity? Is there a broader responsibility, a broader role that needs to be faced here?
Sure, yeah. And I'm not going to be politically correct at all. I definitely feel that, like the so-called Lebanon's friend, whether it's France, whether it's previously the US, the European Union in general, have in the past decades really played, for me, a role that has, like, the aim was always to seek Lebanon stability, especially what was going on in the region, betting on the same political class that, led the country to collapse. So there's definitely a responsibility where I see, like the role of these international stakeholders seeking a kind of status quo that was more or less working just in terms of stability, but turning a blind eye on the other abuses, on abuses against, like, or sometimes, not to be a bit extreme, they've done some, behind closed door advocacy. But like, I can give an example where, for example, the European Union would fund a program, for cyber intelligence, for example, that would be used against demonstrators, or against political dissidents, and that would be arrested. These examples where sometimes, the international support has mostly served to entrench a situation, discrimination, and like lack of respect of rights, That's been, in my view, problematic, and that where the international stakeholder needed to be more vigilant and, requiring more accountability and transparency in their, in their support.
We have a question from Dr. Hussein Amri from Colorado School of Mines about environmental sustainability, which we haven't talked about, but which arguably affects the living conditions of marginalized groups. Is there an environmental sustainability piece, access to water, access to sanitation, that we need to be addressing? Are there ways in which environmental sustainability, being more environmentally conscious, can both alleviate some of the suffering, but also pave a way toward better living conditions for all Lebanese? Is there an environment piece that we need to address that we haven't made part of this conversation yet?
I'm not sure who's the question to, but
Yeah.
if I may jump in, I mean, definitely, yeah, the environmental piece of it is a component. Unfortunately, now in Lebanon, with everything that's going on, the socioeconomic crisis, the explosion, it feels like a bit a luxury to talk about, but we have, just to talk about the trash crisis that's been going on for years now. There's really, again, this lack of sense of responsibility. And here I would, hold everyone responsible, whether it's the state, the political leaders, but also the society itself. And I don't think there has been, a conscious about how to protect resources so it can serve everyone. There has been reports, about, pollution, polluting the river, all of these problems. And I think it would be very hard to address even the projects that was, funded by the European Union, ended up, for recycling, for waste recycling, ended up being a waste basically, and is still not functional. So anyway, I don't know if this really answers the question, but at least, it's definitely a problem that we have to keep in mind.
Yasmin, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the situation in the camps, the environmental situation. Every year we know that the Bekaa floods and people's tents are flooded, and we only start receiving funding when the babies start to freeze or to die of hunger. We had come up with several plans with other NGOs to actually build up the area so that the flooding doesn't happen, and it was rejected by the municipalities, even though it's much more environmentally friendly to do this and to set these stones and pick up the tents, and this will be much better. There was no support. We had another program which was for the cleanup of the Litani, parts of the Litani River, because of the amount of trash and debris in the Litani River, a lot of the agricultural farmers suffer with lack of water, and we were working on this. Again, there was no support from the municipality. And finally, in Shatila and all the Palestinian camps, we know very well that there is no infrastructure, there is no clean water. The electricity is a huge problem. Yearly, we have people dying of electrocution because all the electricity is exposed and it runs together with the water. So there's a lot of work to do on the environmental or infrastructure element, definitely. And now more than ever, we need this kind of intervention.
Beth Graham from RCE Atlanta asks, how can Americans amplify advocacy efforts, and what agencies deliver the biggest impact that people should be supporting?
John, can you repeat the question, please?
First, how can Americans amplify advocacy efforts? And the second is, what agencies deliver the biggest impact that Americans can support monetarily?
I can jump in. I try to be quick to leave the room for others, but it's, I'm based in DC, and it's been a bit challenging to do all this advocacy efforts in DC. There's a more or less a kind of a disinterest in the region in general, except from, like an Iran perspective, to put, more pressure on Iran. So we've seen a growing disengagement from mostly the Trump administration in the region, on Syria specifically, but also on Lebanon. And now the most approach is, to increase sanctions, basically to target Hezbollah. But these sanctions are basically, hurting the whole society. There's definitely, I think, I think that, in the US, Congress and even the administration, they respond to public pressure. And since this is question coming from, like a US citizen, I think there needs to be more, public pressure from us as organization, but also from individual, the US dispatched, a disaster, I forgot the technical name, but like a disaster team to Lebanon, but then withdraw very quickly. So we've heard some, action that has been taken at the early beginning when the explosion, the August 4 explosion occurred, but now I don't think they're continuing any support. So yeah, it's just very challenging to say the least.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I may speak to that, like Sahar was saying, there's generally a disinterest in the whole Syrian refugee crisis. Actually, the whole Syrian crisis. I tell them when we first started this work, everybody wanted to get involved and support. And now, as actually things are getting more and more difficult and more challenging, we're finding it very hard to find the monetary and the moral support for the crisis. The Syrian crisis is not sexy anymore. Just like the Lebanese, we were in the news at the beginning with the explosion, but now people have moved on to the next headline. Actually, I was contacted by several journalists, and then they're like, you know what? No, now we're covering Sudan. No need to cover Lebanon anymore. So we need to keep Lebanon and Syria and the region on top of people's minds. And yes, there are a lot of agencies that are delivering a lot of impact, but then I reiterate again, go to the smaller agencies, the people who have boots on the ground, not the people who are covering overheads and marketing costs. There are many agencies doing very good work with beneficiaries on the ground, and who can really give you a lot for your dollar.
Okay, so I guess that leads us in the final moments to how can people help you? I mean, you have an audience watching this that's interested, that they've made it through 54 minutes of important discussions. What's your call to action for them? What should people be doing?
Do your research. Look at who's active on the ground and what they're doing. For example, with our education program, we have moved the children into a completely virtual education model, where we're providing them with tablets in order to educate them. We educate more than 2,000 refugee children, and we have more than 2,000 children on the waiting list. And we're fundraising for tablets that you can secure and buy through our online fundraiser. Support things like that. Give direct support to education programs, development programs, and again, help us advocate, help us stay in the news, help us put together fundraising tours, set up introductions for us, just for people to hear, like you did today, Jon. This is an amazing platform for us to speak, to give us a voice, and you never know who you might meet in one of these calls and what they might be interested in. It's so hard to tap into American foundations. It's one of the things that I've been trying to do for years. But if you don't get a personal introduction and somebody to vouch for you, we are so foreign to what they're used to, and we're so far away. And even now with the COVID and the restrictions, it's very hard to even get anybody interested to visit and see the work on the ground.
Thank you. Sahar?
Yeah, I mean, advocacy, I think, is a very important tool here in the US. And I think, you have a system where representatives really listen to their to their constituency. We've done this on Syria before, where like call your representative kind of day. We need, to both keep raising our voices about the situation, in the region in general, in Lebanon now, since we're talking about Lebanon, but also exactly like channeling advocacy, keep supporting, like the initiatives that's and highlight, initiatives that's really showed some solidarity among, the different communities. It was interesting to see how after the August 4, like most of the work that has been done by civil society organizations and, members of the community. And I think, the lack of a state, like a strong state, requires that, the support from other states just to support these initiatives, I think.
Okay, I think we may have had a technical problem and Banchi dropped off, but let me thank all three of you for not only compelling, very moving, and I think very important contributions to today's discussion. I appreciate your joining us. I'm grateful to the audience for joining us. These are important issues, as you suggested. These don't get fixed in a month or a year. It's a long-term effort, and I think we have a lot of work to do together to address these all. So thank you very much for giving us your time today, and we will continue to work on these very, very important things. Thank you for all that you are doing for marginalized groups in Lebanon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jon.